Although today it's often thought of as a playground for movie stars and affluent Southern Ontarians, the Muskoka region in Central Ontario is a varied, vibrant part of the province with an equally fascinating history. Andrew Watson is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of History and the Historical GIS Lab at the University of Saskatchewan. He has spent just over a decade digging into that history, and we're pleased to have him here today. As I run out of breath.
Good timing.
Thank you so much for being here, Andrew.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You've devoted a lot of time into studying Muskoka, so you must love it. But you also have a personal connection to it. What is that?
I do, yeah. So my family has a cottage on Lake Joseph in Muskoka, which it's been in the family for about 30 years now, but there's also a longer family history that goes back to the 19th century. So the people that built the cottage in the 1880s were family friends with my ancestors.
And then you still have it in the family?
And it's now in the family, yes. So my father's family rented it for a couple of decades when he was young. And then when he and my mother were just starting their family, they happened to have the opportunity to purchase it in the early 1980s. So it's been in the family for a couple of
That is really interesting. But it's one thing to have a connection to the area, but why study it?
It's a great question. I mean, I spent pretty much every summer of my life growing up visiting the island in Muskoka. And so it really did sort of craft my knowledge of the world, help shape the way I saw the world. And as I started to become interested in history, I started thinking that there was an interesting story in Muskoka because the place that I spent so much of my time in the summer was quite a bit different than some of the other places in Muskoka. Muskoka, as you just finished mentioning, is famous as sort of a resort for the affluent and the wealthy. And some of these massive cottages in Muskoka did not line up very well with the place that was built in the 19th century that I spent so much of my time. So I wanted to explore why it is that my cottage fit into that
It's
that
got
place.
such a rich history. So let's talk about the history of Muskoka.
Sure, absolutely.
So before Europeans came to North America, what groups of Indigenous peoples lived in the Muskoka area?
Well, currently there are 6 First Nations communities in the Muskoka region. 5 of them are very closely connected, are interrelated, and the 6th is a little bit different. So furthest north is the Wasauksing First Nation, formerly known as Perry Island First Nation. And just south of there is Moose Deer Point First Nation, which is closely connected with Wasauksing First Nation. And then further, just south of the Shield, are 3 First Nations that are also closely connected. The Chippewa of Rama First Nation, the Chippewa of Georgina Island, and the Chippewa of Beausoleil First Nations.
And were they able to live in the area year-round, or did they have to leave and then come back?
Sure. And then there's a 6th group that isn't really connected with those 5 groups directly, which is the Mohawk Wata. And yes, so the Chippewa, the Anishinaabeg of this region in South Central Ontario, they, by the middle of the 19th century, and certainly before that, followed a sort of a seasonal cycle of subsistence, where they moved between different points in a much larger suite of places that Muskoka was just part of. So Muskoka's First Nations, their home range included a whole variety of places, which Muskoka was just one part of. So they would spend the spring and much of the summer in fishing grounds. So we're basically where Orillia is now today, and Rama First Nation is today. There's important fishing weirs, as well as the rest of Lake Simcoe and the eastern shores of Georgian Bay were important fishing sites for First Nations people in Muskoka. So they would spend the spring and summer in fishing grounds where they would collect in large groups and sort of arrange marriages and reconfirm sort of familial bonds with groups. And then in the fall and winter, these large groups would then split up into smaller groups based around a dotem, or basically a patrilineal family structure, off into hunting grounds where they would spend time trapping furs and hunting game during the wintertime.
And when the Europeans started moving into the area, what happened to the Indigenous people?
Well, so colonization in Ontario gets going, as early as the 17th century with the French Jesuit missionaries in the Huronia region. But really, concerted settlement in this area of South Central Ontario really only gets going around the 1820s, 1830s. And so, in response to the arrival of white Europeans, the Anishinaabe in South Central Ontario sort of adopt a few sort of strategies to sort of avoid being governed, if you would. They sort of disperse into what is now their First Nations communities on Georgina Island and Rama and Christian Island on Georgian Bay. And the group that eventually end up on Perry Island or Wasauksing spent a lot of time in Muskoka. And so in sort of reaction to the arrival of Europeans, the First Nations sort of split up in a sense to sort of avoid being governed. But they continue to pursue these seasonal rounds of going into Muskoka for hunting, of going to the shores of lakes in Georgian Bay for fishing. And then as the Fisheries Act in 1857 and then the Indian Act in 1876 get put in place, First Nations people are constantly being sort of restricted in their movements, in the ability to follow these seasonal rounds, the ability to govern themselves. And through all these sort of colonizing pressures, Indigenous people in South Central Ontario are able to continue to return to Muskoka in order to pursue fur trapping and hunting and a variety of other subsistence purposes that continue right through into the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
This is the first time that I'm hearing about this, about the relationship there. Do you think that the history of Indigenous people in Muskoka is properly remembered today?
I would say no. I actually had a lot of trouble during my doctoral research finding good sources and finding people to talk to about Muskoka's First Nations history. I think it's, people in Muskoka really are enthusiastic about the history of the place, but the history of Indigenous people is sort of sadly largely forgotten. And I think there's actually a major growing appetite for people in Muskoka to recognize the colonial history of the region and the Indigenous history, the people, the first occupiers of the Muskoka region. So I think things are slowly changing, moving away from that sense that, Indigenous people were once here, but now they're not.
The government once encouraged people to start farms in Muskoka. How did that work out for them?
Right. Well, this is the first attempt to try and colonize Muskoka is to create an agricultural society in Muskoka. So around by the middle of the 19th century, Ontario is pretty much, southern Ontario, the good arable land that's suitable for farming is pretty much filled up. Right? It's not easy for newcomers, for new immigrants to Ontario, or what was then Upper Canada, to find land. And so as they arrive in what's now Ontario, they struggle to find a place, and then they end up deciding to leave and actually go down to the United States where there's more land available. And so in reaction to this, the Upper Canadian government, the colonial government, decides they're going to start opening up a new tract of land, which is the Ottawa-Huron Tract, which is basically the southern strip of the Canadian Shield, the most southern strip of the Canadian Shield. At the time, people were not completely aware of how unsuited this landscape was to agriculture. Very thin soils, acidic soils, swampy, big rocky outcroppings of granite. And so it was.
We're looking at a picture right now of that.
Right, and this is a really nice example. You can see sort of towards the back and on the left-hand side of the screen some rocky outcropping, but also the soils themselves were very thin and not suited to kind of commercial agriculture. People were able to figure out some subsistence strategies, sort of combining agriculture and the forestry economy, and of course the landscape was better suited to raising livestock like the cattle we saw in that picture there.
There's a place called Gravenhurst, and its nickname was Sawdust City. Was there also a lot of forestry happening in Muskoka at the time?
Definitely. Just around the same time that the government is opening up Muskoka for agricultural settlement is also around the same time that they are selling off timber licenses, timber berths to large lumber companies, largely American lumber companies, to begin logging in Muskoka. And at the time, the only real merchantable timber and the people were going after, these companies were going after, were the white pine. So that photo that was just up on the screen before would be all white pine logs that were cut down by logging companies, left next to the shores and streams of lakes and rivers in the area during the wintertime when they were all cut down. And then come the spring thaw, they all get dumped into the water together.
How did that affect the ecosystem there?
In a variety of ways. It caused some erosion problems. So again, the sort of thin soils in Muskoka are especially along the shorelines, are definitely prone to erosion when disrupted on this kind of scale. And then as trees are cut down, you also have a variety of runoff into the water. Muskoka's, the lakes in Muskoka and the Canadian Shield are oligotrophic, which means they have very natural low nutrient content in them. So any influx of runoff into the water can really disrupt the ecology of these lakes.
How did that affect the people that were living there?
Not too badly.
Yeah.
I mean, the scale of logging was significant, so the removal of so much mature white pine had a certain effects on the forest ecology, but the water quality effects from logging were sort of temporary. And so over time, the worst consequences of logging on lake ecosystems were sort of ameliorated or eventually remediated naturally. But there's also, in connection with logging, there's large sawmills, and also in Bracebridge and Bracebridge and Huntsville, large tanning industries. And so the scale of those industries created a variety of point source pollution, so sawdust into the water from these sawmills, and then a variety of tanning effluents that would end up going into the rivers. So these caused a variety of point source pollution problems that, again, over time, the consequences dissipated, but in those moments created dead zones around sawmills in Gravenhurst Bay, and a variety of negative ecological consequences near the tanning industry.
Did many of the people who came to Muskoka to farm, and when they came and realized that they couldn't really do that, did they end up staying there or did they leave?
Sure. Well, quite a few figured out how to combine agriculture on the Shield with forestry. So they would grow crops that were better suited to the Shield, like oats and hay, and sell those to the logging companies who needed them to feed both loggers and their animals, their oxen and horses at work. So there's a nice sort of synergy going on between agriculture and forestry for about 20 or 25 years until the white pine gets exhausted, and then farmers in Muskoka are sort of left without a lot of options for commercial agriculture.
But then something happens, a new industry is created, tourism starts to boom, to come to Muskoka. How did that happen? How did they even know about Muskoka?
It's a good question. So the second part of this, the consequences for farmers, is that many begin to leave, especially the ones living in the backwoods, because the opportunities begin to die off as the trees are removed. But the ones closer to the shores of the larger lakes begin to come to realize a much better use for their land, and that is to cater to the needs of visitors from the city. So the middle of the 19th century late 19th century is a time when cities like Toronto and Hamilton are starting to grow pretty quickly. And people living in these cities, especially people of middle and upper classes, people with means, are beginning to recognize some of the health consequences of a quickly growing urban environment. Right? So there are certain concerns about health and disease, and especially in the summertime. And so there's so on one hand, there are people in the city looking to sort of get out of the city, get into the countryside a little bit. And connected with this is this fascination with wilderness in the late 19th century. This is a sort of pan-North American feeling of the need to return to the wilderness to sort of rejuvenate the spirits, and especially if you're a man, to sort of engage in some sort of masculine activities. And so many people from Toronto and Hamilton, and even places like Pittsburgh and
New York,
Buffalo
right?
and New York, Chicago, are beginning to visit places like Muskoka because it's one of the most accessible but still largely forested and feels like wilderness areas.
How did they get up to Muskoka?
Well, early on, the first tourists to go up to Muskoka would have taken a train from Toronto to what is now Barrie, and then a steamboat from Barrie up north to the end of Lake Couchiching, and then they would have walked the last about 15 kilometers.
So they were really motivated to get up there.
Very motivated, and so the motivation, this enthusiasm that so many people had for Muskoka ends up feeding the sort of the nascent tourism economy in Muskoka. And of course, the train that was originally built to Gravenhurst and then onwards to Bracebridge and Huntsville during the 1870s and 1880s, this is a train initially to try and get out lumber and feed the economy. But tourists quickly latch onto this as a way to get into Muskoka, and then they get aboard steamboats, and the steamboats take them around the lakes to resort hotels and the beginnings of a few cottages in different places around the lake. So,
and once they were in Muskoka, what would they do? Would they go hunting? Would they go fishing, or just lie by the pool?
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, I mean, nowadays
that's the idea that we have
yeah.
when we go to college. The cottage, that's what we just want to do, just lie around and do nothing.
Absolutely.
But what did they do?
Well, early on, you have people who are trying to immerse themselves in this wilderness experience, right? So, some of the first tourists to Muskoka are literally sort of 20-year-old, 25-year-old students or young professionals who have time to take off to go and just explore a little bit.
And money.
Yeah, and money, exactly. And then there's a whole other group that's sort of the same segment of society, but are interested in going hunting and fishing, right? And so these are people that in some cases they're bringing provisions with them from the city, and they're living off the land for a couple of weeks with guides. But then very quickly, this shifts because people, these farmers in Muskoka who are struggling with making ends meet, begin to realize the economic potential of these visitors who are coming with wealth, with money to spend. And so they sort of begin to transition. They align their economy with this tourism. And they turn their houses into boarding houses, the boarding houses into small hotels, and in some cases those small hotels turn into very grand hotels. And they are able to sort of add value to their agricultural and rural economy by providing accommodations, by providing meals, by providing services for people who are building cottages in some cases. And so the economy, especially close to the lakes, begins to transform to take up the opportunities available to people who are visiting Muskoka during the summer season.
Now, the people in Muskoka who had the boarding houses, et cetera, how did they get provisions in for these tourists?
Right. So in the fresh articles, things like meat and dairy, fresh vegetables and fruit, these items would have been provided locally. And the real advantage that these local households had in providing for the tourists is that those items didn't transport very well from the city on train and then by steamboat. So these settlers, these first-generation settlers who switched from commercial agriculture to tourism, are able to still do a little bit of agriculture, but it's now catered entirely to the needs of the tourists. Whereas the rest of the sort of other items, you get canned food, dry foods,
And also
would have been
steamships
shipped
came
up.
into play at this time too, right?
That's right. So
Yeah.
they get to the lakes by train, and then once they're on the lake, they get put aboard steamboats. This is the interior of a supply boat. So these are described.
That's a boat?
This is the interior of actually a small steamboat in
I
Muskoka.
thought that was a store.
So a lot of these steamboats, these supply boats, as they were called, were in connection with a general store, or in some cases a farm, and they basically set up a small general store, a subset of their business, inside these supply boats. And these supply boats, rather than having individuals come to the general store in a lot of cases because of the effort it would take to get across the lake or travel to the general store in town, these businesses created floating general stores, which by the turn of the 20th century, some people are calling Eaton's in miniature, right? So like a floating department store. They would go from place to place around the lake, and you would do your shopping on it. So in some cases, you're buying local produce from farmers that was produced locally. In some cases, you're buying mail order items that you would have asked for, or just the regular items they had on board in terms of dry goods.
I'm thinking too, because in the summertime here, this is when everybody goes to their cottages. Back then, when the tourists ran dry, I guess, when they stopped coming, because it was winter, because it was cold, for whatever reason,
Yep.
what did the residents of Muskoka do? How did they support themselves?
Support their economy, sure. Well, yeah, there's a little bit of shoulder season. You know, some people sticking around to go hunting and fishing into the fall. But over the winter time, the economy shifts quite a bit. So there's no tourism. But throughout the 19th and into the early 20th century, there's still quite a bit of logging. So this is the time, the winter season is when settlers, these pioneers, the homesteaders, would have been engaged in the agroforestry economy. They would have gone off to work in a logging camp, cutting down pine trees and sending them down into the rivers in the spring.
Now, owning a cottage, it's a luxury item. Not many people can afford one.
Right.
How did the cottage ownership in Muskoka become so expensive?
Well, I would say that early on, it's always been kind of a place where the wealthy have their cottages. So in the 19th century, probably the most expensive cost was getting there, right? The train and then the steamboat. And staying in a hotel or owning a cottage was not actually the most expensive part. I mean, you know, in the 1880s, 1890s, you could buy an island for what amounted to $1 or $2 an acre. So not very expensive. In building a cottage, depending on how much you wanted to build it for, it wouldn't have been a prohibitive cost necessarily either. Certainly not compared to the cost of getting to Muskoka on a regular basis. But by the 1930s into the 1940s, certainly after the World War II, the cost to owning a home, owning a cottage is coming down quite a bit. So instead of having to take a train and a steamboat to get to your cottage, you can drive on highways and you can take a motorboat to get to a lot of cottages. More places for cottages are starting to open up as landowners are subdividing and selling off smaller lots. And what you see in cottage country and generally everywhere from the Kawartha Lakes and Halliburton into different places of Muskoka is that smaller lakes are now becoming accessible to people. Roads are being built into these areas, and even working class families are now able to afford a piece of land and put up a small prefabricated cottage. And so you have this period between the late 40s and into the 1980s, even the early 1980s, where cottaging is actually quite accessible for people. Now, Muskoka has always had this legacy of being a place for the affluent and quite wealthy, but there are a lot of cases in the post-war period where cottaging became quite accessible to the average person in Ontario.
Now, as an environmental historian, what are some of the lessons that you take away from Muskoka's story?
Well, I think there's two big lessons, but I think I'll go with three. The first lesson is that Muskoka is a shield environment, right? It's not a productive environment that produces a lot of the things that people who live in Muskoka require. So Muskoka is dependent on a lot of inputs. And I think it's important to pay attention to the kinds of things that Muskoka can provide, like fuel wood and maybe hydroelectricity, but be conscious of the amount of consumption that is required to live in a place like Muskoka. And then I think the second issue that's probably, I think, one of the most important issues for Muskoka today is to realize how integral the tourism economy is to Muskoka. That people who cottage or vacation at hotels in Muskoka are dependent on a seasonal or on a permanent population of residents to provide the services and maintain the economy. And so it's a responsibility, I think, of tourists and cottagers to keep in mind the responsibility of the maintaining and looking after the economy. And the third, which is what we started with, is to realize that Muskoka is a settler colonial place. This is a place that has a long history of colonization. In the last few years, there's been quite a bit of attention to conflicts between cottagers and Indigenous communities in Ontario. And I think people in Muskoka are well positioned, I think, to be sensitive to this issue and pay attention and learn about the history of First Nations people in our region.
And do you think that cottaging has helped or hurt Muskoka's environment?
I think for the most part, it's definitely helped. I think there's a lot of sort of conservation ethos. There's a lot of concern about maintaining water quality and protecting the environment. But it comes at the flip side, which is significant shoreline development, right? So as this 19th century history of reformatting the landscape into private properties for farmers eventually allows those landowners to cut up the shoreline into individual, small segment properties for cottagers to build summer homes on. And this puts intense pressure nowadays in the 21st century, intense pressure on the shoreline environment, that sort of sensitive area between the land and the water, causing some possibility for shoreline runoff and water quality concerns. So I think overall, tourism has been a sort of a benefit to Muskoka's environment, but there are many opportunities where that can lead to ecological consequences that are unfavorable to.
Thank you so much for being here, Andrew. We've learned a lot from you.
No problem, my pleasure.
And hopefully next time we'll get a chance to talk about zombies, because I know that's another passion of yours.
Sure. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit tvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.